Welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. Oh, we have so much ground we're going to be covering today. A lot of people you're probably turning in tonight expecting to hear our deep dive on the dental program. That's still coming, but we have an opportunity to have a conversation with somebody who is cooler than that. So we're jumping all over that today.
Is
Um,
it is that hard to be cooler than a dentist though?
I mean, they have money, I'm told, and nice
True,
cars.
true.
So there's that. And just like that, we've tipped the hand on who our guest is today. Very excited to welcome back to the show former city councilor, pundit, advisor, I don't know, to the political elite in the province. We're going to find out today. We're very excited to welcome back Mr. Jeromy Farkas. Jeromy, how are you doing today?
Good. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh no, I'm glad. I really appreciate that you're willing to have the conversation. I can tell you that after our oh my God, I just Danielled. I can tell you that. Wow. I'm so sorry, everybody. What I was trying to do was relate an anecdote. That's how I'll get into that one. That there were a lot of people who responded really, really positively to our last conversation, particularly your story about being stuck on the side of the mountaintop, and that that was great. I think that it's a very different side of Jeromy Farkas. So I'm very and you've consistently displayed that. So I'm very excited to be. I can tell you that's going to be my bit for the show. Um, yeah, we're very excited to have you back.
Well, I appreciate it. I appreciate you having an open mind to me. And we were chatting just a little bit before we started recording on just the type of work that you've been trying to do. No pre-scripted, unfiltered, no holds barred. And it's interesting when I was in politics running for office, right? You have folks who are around you, communications advisors, media people, and part of their job, or at least how they see it, is to protect the candidate, right? So it's interesting to me just to be in formats like this where I don't have the questions in advance. I don't have a hard time limit or a meeting somewhere I can run off to be able to extricate myself. So there's a little bit of, let's say, vulnerability there too, but it's a lot hell of a lot more fun, man.
I think it's way more fun, and maybe that's why. I mean, what you just described there, the comms folks protecting the candidate. Um, maybe that's why we can't get a reply back from Danny about the interview request that we have her. But we did. Fun fact: we did put in a request for a local Calgary journalist who may or may not have run for mayor back in 1998. And we definitely did get our picture of him. So we're super thrilled about that. We're hoping to get a response back from him, but we'll see what we see.
Well, I still got that journalist's number, so if you need it,
Well,
uh,
if you could put in a good word, because like here's the
I will
thing,
put it in a good word.
we have good faith conversations here. It's not about setting somebody up. It's not about gotcha. It's not about that. It's about having a good faith conversation and talking about the things and the stuff. And it's never like oh, we're gonna get you. And if Danny ever did agree to be on the show, it wouldn't be a welcome to the breakdown. This episode is Danielle Smith sucks. Here's 10 reasons why we're glad to welcome Premier Daniel Smith. It wouldn't be that because that's just
Mm.
not conducive to anything. So, and there are some things that Daniel Smith has done that have not been terrible. So, do with that what you will. Not at all what we're here to talk about today. Um, for clarity's sake, we're recording this on July 2nd,
Mm.
and there was an announcement today. And this is going to kind of be my lead into the first topic that I wanted to get your thoughts on. It was announced today, just I think around noon, maybe 10:30. I'm not sure. Um, that the water restrictions in Calgary have started to be eased. Indoor water restrictions in Calgary are now lifted. Everybody, break out the bath bombs. It's delightful. Um, Outdoor water restrictions, maybe not so much running the kids through the sprinklers yet, but we're on the right path. But as
Mm.
somebody who had an inside track to the city of Calgary and the inner workings of that apparatus, I did have some questions that I wanted to ask you about in regards to the water crisis.
Mm.
So, from a scale of 1 to 12, um, what would you give the city's response to handling this crisis? And if you want to break it down between, I don't know, the first week and a half and the rest of it, you can do that if you so choose.
Yeah, so there's a couple pieces there, right? There's the actual engineering piece. There's the identifying that there's a problem. There's getting all the pieces in place to be able to address the problem. And then there's the leadership and project management kind of through that. So that's sort of one central piece. And then there's the whole communications and kind of political leadership piece, right? So I've actually had a great the great opportunity to shadow around some of the folks who actually do some of the sort of filling potholes and emergency maintenance and stuff like that. And I have incredible confidence in that team, the professionalism, all the people that are involved at the ground level. I think the challenge that Calgarians had though is with just the communications piece. What exactly has gone wrong? How do we relate that to the everyday? How people need to change their behavior? And then I think one of the bigger issues I think we ran into is just the lack of clarity in terms of, all right, we know that the big pipe is busted. What does the actual family do? And then when you talk largely in percentage terms, in terms of throughput, millions of liters, targeted reductions, this makes sense from an engineering standpoint, but it doesn't make sense to say a family with kids who need to know, well, how many times a day can we flush the toilet? Is our dishwasher okay? How many loads of laundry, that sort of thing. So probably the biggest takeaway I had is I thought that they could have been a little bit more effective rather than say, reduce your usage by 25%. Instead, perhaps some more just clear advice in absolute terms, say a target for how many times you should be flushing your toilet, how many times per week on average to use your washing machine, that sort of stuff. But it's very easy though to be an armchair critic, and myself having been on the emergency management committee of council during COVID, I know how fast life comes at you in situations like that. It's very easy to criticize, but if anything, my message would be like, we're still not quite necessarily out of this in terms of the outdoor piece, but there's probably going to be a lot of, hopefully, some soul searching done, a bit of a retrospective in terms of what went right, what went wrong, and then more broadly writ, well, what's this say about the state of infrastructure, period, within the city of Calgary? And I believe that that's going to be really, if I had criticisms, where my main focus would be. And even just in terms of my time as a member of council, we knew then, this council knew then that we had a ticking time bomb on our hands. We knew then that we still had wooden water pipes. We knew then that we had lead water pipes servicing hundreds, if not thousands of homes, right? So at that point, council still made the values decision rather than focus on the infrastructure piece, that instead be going for the big splashy things like an arena, a BMO center, all incredible things to have in the city. But, I just think that sky high 30,000 foot introspective in terms of what's the state of the infrastructure system more generally, that's going to be some very, very uncomfortable conversations around the council table.
You gave me a whole lot to unpack there. I'm going to try to do my best. Um, One of the pieces that is fascinating to me, and you talked about it, is the communications. And this is an area where, if it was 2010, uh, I can understand to some degree how the city might be out of practice, perhaps, in crisis communications. But when you take a look at the last decade, there's been some things. Whether we're talking about the floods, whether we're talking about all of the smoke advisories, whether we're talking about the COVID situation, one would think if there was one thing that a machine as big as the city of Calgary would have practice at and would be able to get right, it would be the communications. So I'm curious what your thoughts are, speculative only, or substantive, if you can. What your thoughts are on why the comms were so, like, what happened, do you think, internally? Because it was wild to watch the first week and a half. And I just don't understand how, given everything, like it's like if you teach a toddler how to ride a bike without training wheels and you spend 6 months doing it and they're doing great. And then all of a sudden one day they just ride their bike into the side of a building and you're going, what happened here?
Yeah, and what I will say is, I guess you can identify issues with this, but what I will say is that in terms of some of the emergency management situations I was involved with as a member of council, what I thought really made for strong, cohesive communications and just more generally public leadership was the fact that as chair, the council member in charge of the emergency management committee would keep informed all of the council members there. There were much more relatively quick declaration of a state of local emergency, which allowed for much more quickly say decisions around say getting procurement, suppliers, that sort of thing. So I would say that that's probably one of the pieces that fell short, was just not the recognition that we were in deep shit. I think that was the thing. Is like the leadership I think needed to be explicit in terms of the danger and the risk that we were in. And I think we probably could have benefited from a quicker declaration, given that the facts on the ground were the same throughout the entire process, or even deteriorated. Another piece is that just on an interpersonal level, of course, we butt heads a lot, but what I found was very effective for Naheed Nenshi in times of crisis like this is he, rather than take an informed approach, which is the bare minimum that I think a leader should do, say with their council, he would pull in all the other council members and actually give them work to do, right? To say, well, these are the messages. I need you to be here and there to be able to spread the word. And it actually helped during COVID. Of course, there was some debate over public health policy generally, but during COVID, each of the council members had various sort of portfolios or areas of the crisis, like around business continuity or community support or infrastructure. I think a similar sort of model would have really helped in this situation, because right now what we see is just a council kind of like eating their own, where there's just a lot of finger pointing, and there's also the challenge too if say a council member or the mayor were to start pointing fingers, say at other orders of government, well, they better demo up proof if they're going to blame, say, the province or the feds, as we saw in this case, right? So, at a minimum, when you're in times of crisis, you shouldn't be criticizing the person beside you that's supposed to be pulling in the same direction. So I think that that's probably a big piece for the breakdown. And then it's hard to say what went wrong in not having been internally in those meetings. And, the easiest thing in the world is to be outside of those meetings, standing on the sidelines, lobbing grenades. So, I'd want to, if I can take a bit of a dodge on this, be relatively muted in my criticism. I'm sure that a lot of this stuff will come to bear, but it really touched, I think, a raw nerve for a lot of folks, where they see a council that is perhaps just very, very focused on the hugely big picture things like a climate emergency, or say the debates over Hanukkah and the Middle East war, stuff like that, right? So you have a council that's been so focused on these hugely big picture issues. I think the public has just been not taking well to such a critical failure, something that is so central and so fundamental to why we even have a city hall in the first place. So I think that it touched a raw nerve, and I don't think you have the rally around the flag or the rally around the leader effect that, say, political science professors would tell you about, where in times of crisis, people come together and support the leadership. Because in this case, it's not an external emergency, something like a wildfire or flood that's happened to a city. It's a falling down of something that is internal. It's something that, or maybe even the perception that council is asleep at the switch when it comes to something of their own responsibility and accountability.
Well, it's fascinating because you talked about the Stampede piece, or not, sorry, the Stampede. Well, I mean, kind of Stampede grounds kind of piece, the arena, the BMO Center, all of the investment that have gone into those big, shiny, big ticket items. But to me, it's kind of not dissimilar from, like I've seen people who have very expensive cars on the roads of Calgary right now with flat tires and broken axles because of the potholes. And that's not being hyperbolic. That's a thing that happens in this city now. Anybody who tries to drive Country Hills Boulevard particularly in the northeast end of town, like best of luck. Hope you brought treads, because it's the pothole situation, and it's such a small, benign thing, but the pothole situation is like nuts right now. Um, you talked about the fact that the city had identified that there were problems with the water infrastructure when you were in council. I, I mean, the wooden pipes bit, I'm just picturing like a Disney cartoon right now, with the animals tending to the wooden pipes in the trees. But like, how long has, to your knowledge, has there been even a vague awareness of, you use the phrase ticking time bomb? How long has that been going on for?
Well, just in terms of the type of precast construction, it's not just Calgary that was laying this type of pipe from the 60s to the mid 70s, right? This was a technology and a type of construction that was used all across North America. So when you're just going to, say, conferences of municipal administrators, or you're talking to your colleagues across Canada or across the United States, we knew that there was catastrophic failures happening with this type of construction from coast to coast to coast, all across North America, right? And this is an issue where once you sort of are aware of it, you have a fiduciary duty, you have a responsibility to address it. But unfortunately, just the politics at the time was that council just did not want to make themselves aware of something that they may now have to be responsible for. And people can Google this, but if you just Google Farkas Farrell lead pipes, you'll see Councillor Farrell and I don't want to misrepresent myself. I was much more Drew Farrell's sidekick in this than just supporting her in this. But once we became aware that residential homes were being serviced with lead pipes, we pushed very hard for an accelerated process to fix these pipes. And we were talking that it would be an expensive fix in the tune of millions of dollars, or maybe tens of millions. But bluntly, at the time, council was gung ho on the four mega projects, things like the BMO Center expansion, the new arena, these much more big flashy things. But I supported Councillor Farrell, and I don't want to necessarily misrepresent her, but I believe that our position jointly was really about, we need to get the fundamentals right. We have to stick to our knitting. We have to focus on why we have a city in the first place. And if we can't address these so fundamental building blocks of municipal responsibility, then we don't have the legs to stand on when it comes to, say, the Olympics or the arena or the BMO Center. But unfortunately, or fortunately, this has really been daylighted, but it's going to be a significant fix to address and overhaul our system more generally, but it will eat away at some of the resources or the money that the city council have to work with on vis-a-vis, say, some of their other pet projects or other priorities.
I mean, one of the other things that you mentioned in the opening statement that you made there was, we haven't seen, it doesn't appear that we've seen the same sort of flocking to the leader, if you will, as we have seen in other situations. What do you think it's just the external factor, or was it the communications? Was it all of the above?
I think part of it is nothing happens in a vacuum, right? So you have other councillors maybe jockeying for leadership. You have us coming into the silly season before the election cycle comes up. You have deep unpopularity, but I think for, at least in my own personal life, all I can say is that if anybody comes to the table with humility and says, well, we don't know what's happening, we're still figuring things out, there's a lot of folks that will actually give you some room to work with, right? But if you just try to present yourself as completely in charge, completely confident, absolutely knowledgeable, then you really expose yourself when the facts can so quickly move on the ground. And I think it turned off quite a lot of people to see the finger pointing so immediately toward the provincial government, especially when the city of Calgary, at least under this council, had never made one ask of the province when it comes to, say, the core infrastructure like water pipes. Their number one ask was the arena, which the province was very happy to spend $300 million to help make happen, right? So I think the finger pointing, I think, was probably one of the killers here, where people can respect, I think, that if you're in a crisis situation, you don't know everything. You try to be as confident as you can, but I think It's a temptation for leaders in those crisis situations to try to put on an overly brave front. People can tell the bullshit from a mile away, and I think that there's something to be said for just humility and saying, well, we don't know what we don't know. We're still figuring things out. This is what you can do to help in the interim. And I think just having some remembering your humanity through events like that, I think it's so important versus having something that's super glossy, super slick, and professional. And I think, for better or for worse, the mayor, even as he toured Premier Redford, Prime Minister Harper during 2013 during the floods, I think that there was sort of a just much more nitty gritty, let's get to work, let's roll up our sleeves, let's figure out what's happening kind of approach versus the sometimes City Hall here in Calgary can have this lockdown communication structure where you have hundreds of people vetting and reviewing press releases and trying to get the press conference just right. And when you have 200 people in a room trying to figure out what to do, it's sort of like a racehorse being designed by committee. All you'll end up with at the end is a camel, and that's not because any of the people in the room are bad people or don't know what they're doing. It's just you have so many cooks in the kitchen, you're only going to end up with a mess. And I think that's what we saw, at least in the first couple of days.
Well, this was one of the interesting things, and this is where we're going to start to pivot a little bit to our next topic, um, juxtaposing the communication and the reaction from the public to this event and the 2013 floods. I mean, we did have water issues during the 2013 floods above and beyond the flooding. There were issues with the water supply being heavily impacted. So the the fascinating thing to me is that was such a lightning strike moment for the mayor of the time, Naheed Nenshi. He did exceptionally well. And I'm wondering if you can talk about why it is that you think that that situation is it the self-inflicted wound perception in that we had this infrastructure, it's supposed to work, and you crap the bed, or is there more to it? What allowed Nenshi to, I don't want to say capitalize because that almost makes it sound like it was an inauthentic response on his part, and I'm not convinced in any way that it was. But what allowed Nenshi to get in front of things, and turn that into a generation of goodwill, where it seems like the opposite has been true in this current situation?
You know, having worked with them up close, I think that my observation would be it wasn't so much him getting in front of things. Obviously, like I think just on a personal level, even his friends would tell you that ego is an issue. He is a guy who likes being at the center of things. But my own observation is that perhaps that's true to a certain extent, but he'd also be very good at getting out of the way to let the subject matter experts speak and to get a sense of listening. All right, is this overly technical or does there need to be a political lens layered on top of it? So, for example, if you have um, part of it's also just protection, right? So when I think of, say, an engineer that's being out there saying, well, we've calculated it's a 26% reduction that's required, then you have a political layer on top of that saying, well, it's not the engineer that needs to be the face of making the sacrifice. And at that point, it's political leadership that's required. It's the message about, as cliche as it became during COVID, we're all in this together, and there's going to have to be some shared pulling in the same direction, some share of the same glory, but also the same sacrifice. I don't know how much perhaps the fundamentals have changed over COVID, right? I think that COVID really just highlighted a lot of the cleavages in society. You have, depending where, you don't have to be an anti-vaxxer to say, look at, say, being furious, for example, at your local say small business being closed, but the Costco's or the Walmart's continuing, right? So when you have folks that say, for example, are saying that maybe a quarter of the usage of water is residential, all right, I'm doing my part, but the car washes are still allowed, right? So there's an explanation piece to this, and perhaps after COVID, where people are just kind of exhausted at collective action, maybe this is just daylighted. Well, now that this is the first emergency past COVID, people are fatigued with emergencies generally, and making that commitment to shared action. So, long-winded way of saying maybe coming out of COVID, maybe this was going to be a real tough issue, period. But my observation, back to your central question, is My observation of Nenshi is that he always tried to pull people in rather than keep them out. And bluntly, if you give a person a job to do and you give them the opportunity to be front and center and to be the face of things occasionally, then you actually get their buy-in. So that's probably one of the biggest surprises to me, was that each of the individual members of council, including Sonia Sharp, they didn't seem to be given a job, for lack of a better word. And I know that perhaps there's some personal animosity or maybe political tension if, say, Sonia Sharp is, or somebody is trying to think about a run for mayor next year. But that said, I think that the better path forward for everybody is if you can present being a team, but that's just not the opportunity that at least was taken by this council with these events.
Well, Nenshi as a team builder is a hell of a jumping off point. So we saw about a week and a half ago from the date of this recording, the NDP elected a new leader. And in what was a surprise to, I'm sure, just about nobody, Naheed Nenshi is the new leader of the NDP. But it's not just like, oh, he squeaked it out. He did. It's he thumped it. It appears that all of the membership growth that happened over the course of the leadership race is directly attributable to Naheed Nenshi. So what are you let's start with what are your sort of high level impressions of the leadership race, and then I want to talk a little bit more because you and Naheed, you talked about this on our last conversation. You and Naheed have built quite a friendship, so I want to talk a little bit more about what it is that you think makes Naheed the able to accomplish that feat, I'll say. But what were sort of your high level impressions of the NDP leadership race? Because I'm sure you were paying a little attention.
Yeah, and I would say just the biggest thing for me was the margin at 86%. I think that poses a few immediate problems, and for a guy with an ego, like at 86%, I think the challenge will be for him and his leadership to assume that he's already got the answers. He's got the mandate to really reform the party in his own image. I think the temptation will be to let the foot off the gas, the persuasion. I think that if anything, he's got to lean in right now to listen to his caucus. He's got to listen to Albertans. And at 86%, though, man, the temptation has got to be immense. It's got to be extreme for anybody in that situation to think that, well, you're the new hot shot, you're the new sheriff in town, and that's going to be probably one of the first challenges that he's going to have, is just managing that, knowing that this is not about winning. He has not won an election. It's just he's won the leadership. And then the second piece is I also worry with that margin when you think of the stalwarts, the Kathleen Ganleys, the Sarah Hoffman, they didn't even break double digits. So what happens in a situation like that? Because it's a little bit counterintuitive, but in these leadership races, you want a little bit of a closer margin than that. Take, for example, say the UCP leadership. It might be a bad example, but the reason I mention it is, say, look at these, say, Rebecca Schultzes of the world, the Rajan Sanis, and so on. They came relatively close enough. Obviously, it wasn't super close, but they had enough of a showing that in the party going forward, they were able to save face. But they also had the level of investment and the motivation to make this party succeed going forward, because based on the showing they had, the votes, the dollars they raised going forward, they had an incentive to build the UCP up, because for the next leadership, they could be within spitting distance of inheriting what they built. So it's counterintuitive, but you want to at least have enough of a buy-in from those people so that they're able to be your champions, your lieutenants out in the community to build up the party. Whereas for Hoffman and Ganley, my view is that their support was so dismal that it was basically a repudiation of them by the membership. To what extent that would say Nenshi capturing lightning in a bottle and having the special recipe, I'm reluctant to embrace that narrative. I think it's more so the fact that the NDP establishment is just for so long focused on purity or over pragmatism. They've had the purity test. They've been so overly ideological. They've put so many terms and conditions on being an NDP member and an NDP voter that in my sense, it didn't necessarily, obviously it's a bit of both, but for me, it wasn't so much about Nenshi reinventing the secret sauce. I think it was more just a demonstration of how out of touch the old NDP establishment was when it came to actually speaking to Albertans more generally. So I think that there's a couple things in there, but no amount of spin and no amount of my punditry can reduce the incredible thing that Nenshi did. That man, he that was an incredible accomplishment to come in as an outsider to be able to pull off what he did without even having had a day of time as an NDP member. There's nothing that I can do or say that will diminish what he achieved. The things I've mentioned are probably problems for tomorrow, but they're not necessarily problems for today.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up the NDP establishment because there have been a lot of concerns raised about the internal NDP culture. There were a lot of concerns raised about nominations heading into the last election.
Mm-hmm.
We did a whole series where we had conversations with former MLAs and former ministers of the NDP who were talking about cultural issues that existed inside of the NDP. Um, but you know, it, I'm curious because like you've talked about Nenshi being a team builder, you've talked about him as being somebody who delegates roles, and he's certainly delegated a fair amount of roles coming out of this leadership race. But almost as striking as, like nobody's surprised, I think, that Rocky Pancholi got deputy leader. Like gasp. She shut down her campaign that had a lot of energy to back his and become his chair. So that's not a huge shock there. But I mean, I have not seen, and perhaps I've missed it. I haven't seen big ticket roles announced for any of the other former leadership candidates. I haven't seen Hoffman be handed anything big. I haven't seen Ganley handed anything big. Do you think that's because of the small relatively small showing in the final vote count, or is there also a component of and now we're changing the guard because we're changing the guard?
Well, I think if they were to leave, it's on their own terms. It's because they want to leave, and it's not because Nenshi will be pushing them out. I think that they'll have a. I can't speak for him, obviously, but my perception would be if they wanted to stay involved, that he would welcome that. I think it's not just his own personality, but I think it's also smart politics. I think that it's really important for him to be able to show that he is a team builder, that he's a leader, and he's not going to hold, say, what any of them might have said during the campaign against him. It was a little bit just quizzical to me to see how scorched earth that Ganley in particular was going on Nenshi, as well as some of her proxies and people associated with her. I just thought that was just crazy politics. But I think the reason that she got away with that is he's, as funny as it sounds, he's not the kind of guy who holds grudges that way. I think that they knew that they could keep punching him, and he wasn't going to punch back. So it might have been irritating, but I think coming from such a position of strength, he didn't really have the need to be able to respond to that. I also think that he's going to have that ability to remake the party, and I think there's going to be quite a bit of soul searching that's going to have to happen, especially as maybe members will be considering disassociating with the federal party. That could have potential ramifications, but at this point, I think it's so early days after the vote. These campaigns are probably just taking a much needed rest and relaxation, as well as jumping right into Stampede. So I wouldn't read the tea leaves too much on this one. I would say they definitely, from my perspective, I think it would be absolutely insane for them not to have some sort of role, especially Jody, who I think really punched above her weight. But that said, I will say that I think the casualty of of the Nenshi juggernaut was the fact that Rocky didn't have the runway that that she probably could have enjoyed. I thought she was probably the most energetic. She had the most. I thought she had by far the best introduction video to Albertans, and she was squarely focused on winning the general election, speaking to all of Alberta in a way that I don't think any of the other candidates had. So if I have a little bit of sadness, it's that we didn't actually get to see Rocky in her prime and firing on all four cylinders, because I think that it would have been incredible to see what other ideas she might have had. Because again, disassociating from the federal party, withdrawing support for the carbon tax. That these were very clear signals to me that she was in it to win it.
I mean, I love that you brought up Jody, because the sense that I have of the NDP leadership race is that everybody who was watching it was kind of going like, "Oh, it's not this time, but damn, she's doing some awesome stuff." And I think if I was to look at all of the leadership candidates, and no disrespect to any of the other leadership candidates, the one that I'm most excited to see what they do next is Jody, and that's just me
Well,
speaking.
and that's the whole point of, like, there's a bit of meta analysis involved in why you would run for leader, even if you didn't have a chance to win, right? It would be about elevating your stature. It's about putting issues on the table, like say Gil wanted to. It's about developing your profile for the next time around. For those reasons, I thought that the other candidates, they had a great success despite the fact that they didn't win. But that's why I also find that say Ganley and Hoffman are probably the biggest losers, in that they could have won, but they used their opportunity and to speak to Albertans more generally, and largely, in my view, squandered it.
I want to talk about, I mean, first I have to point out, just because I'm that guy, I feel like Rocky's more of a V6 or a V8, not a full banger, but that's just me. The comms. I mean, this is one of the things that I find myself going like, did purely speculative with no evidence whatsoever. Did did Nenshi recruit all of the top comms people from the city of Calgary to come work on his campaign? Because not only were his comms during his campaign like solid, but his comms coming out of the campaign, his response to Daniel Smith, his Pinocchio Stampede videos. This is not NDP comms the way that NDP comms have been done over the last 4, 8 years. This is this is a whole next level thing. Is this Nenshi driving this, or does he have some very smart people giving him very good advice?
Well, it's similar even to his performance in emergency situations, right? You sort of get to see the end result, the product, but good leadership is having those people around you, right? It's being able to keep the competent people in place, to encourage them, to give them the runway, to build them up as leaders within their own area. And I think a lot of what you see of Nenshi is largely Nenshi Incorporated, right? You have the people around him like Zane, Shima, Darcy, others who can be his sounding boards, people who can be. And other politicians have handlers, but he has friends and confidants, right? This is really, and I think that if you're to, it was kind of inside baseball, but many people would tell you that they have their concerns or criticisms of Nenshi as an individual. Obviously, he's somebody who excites a lot of either hate or love, depending on who you ask. But even the people who dislike him would tell you that the people around him are just very fun to be around too. So what you see, I would say, in that campaign is people who go back all the way to student union politics and leadership, right? These are people who have had fun together in the trenches. They've been tested through fire. Like, for successive terms, Nenshi, he could never be beaten. He couldn't be bought. For better or for worse, the guy in public is very much the guy in private. For the highs and the lows that come with a statement like that. But this is a guy who's used to winning, and he doesn't suffer fools, and he would absolutely be running a professional campaign and competent communicators around him. And he's the guy who likes to dig into the details. He likes to really know what he's talking about before he opens his mouth. So obviously, I might not agree with what he has to say, but he is lightning quick, and he has a very, very solid understanding of the facts, enough to be able to get away with some incredible spin sometimes too.
I love that line you threw down. Other politicians have handlers. He has friends and advisors. That's one of the beefs that we hear people express about Alberta politics, and now that he's on the Alberta provincial politics level, is that political parties tend to have yes people. They tend to have people who, as candidates, people who will do what they're told, who will be the very, very best show poodles, who will read the talking notes, who will do all of the things. And it's fascinating to see somebody like Nenshi, who's going to be leading the conversations and being influenced by his friends, as opposed to being told, "Here's what you're gonna do today." Um, So that's going to be
Yeah, and my while we're talking about the personnel, like, I think one of the biggest issues that he had in his twilight years as mayor was a lot of these folks had left. It wasn't for dislike of him. I think it was just more of being tired of the daily grind of being in city government. Uh, yeah, Cheam and others leave for the private sector, and I think that a lot of the issues and the miscalculations he had was because that team gradually whittled down in his final years as mayor, and some of the mistakes around the Olympics and so on, I think really showcased the fact that the bench strength wasn't there internally. But I think the mistake that conservatives will have, I think, is to assume that Nenshi, the NDP leader, is basically the same as Nenshi, say, in his final 1 or 2 years as the mayor of Calgary, tired after 3 terms. No, I think from the outside looking in, observing, this is basically the equivalent of a high school reunion where everybody is on board. Everyone that's either helped him in his 25 years in leadership roles has come back out of the woodwork to help him. I think they're extremely energized. Whether you like Nenshi or not, I think you have to respect and appreciate the bench strength that he's been able to assemble, and the fact that it's not just him that's emerald. It's not a long and tired mayor. It's somebody who's been able to tap into all of the relationships, the resources that he's been cultivating in this moment. And I think that that's just it's expressed itself in the 86% number. It's expressed itself in his public speaking, in the videos, and I think that the temptation amongst conservatives, I think, will be to underestimate this guy. But man, my message would be to underestimate him at your own peril.
Yeah, well, the fact that they're spending like upwards of $1 million on advertising says that they're scared because you don't drop that kind of money on an irrelevancy. I don't see them spending $1 million going after the leaders of the Alberta Party or the Alberta Liberal Party. So there's very
Well,
clearly,
I think that's actually gonna help him. It's counterintuitive, but at a time where his biggest risk is, say, alienating some of the caucus that didn't support him. Nothing rallies a team and unifies like an external threat. So when his criticism of him was that he was the anti-partisan, that he wasn't partisan enough, that he couldn't play in that sandbox. But when you have the UCP and Danielle Smith going full blast with these very partisan ads, I think that it actually helps him solidify his support within the caucus because uh, as funny as it sounds, again, it's an external threat to unify the team. This is the best possible opportunity that he can have to show his caucus that might have doubts about him that he can play in that kind of sandbox.
I got two more Nenshi questions before we get to some of the stuff that you are doing. The first one is as a seasoned political operative yourself, I'm sure you know one of the biggest things that anybody does when they're engaging in any sort of political adventure is to tap all of their friends and family and engage their entire network in order to try to support their endeavor. So I'm curious, is Jeromy Farkas a member of the NDP now?
I I am. I voted. I felt that I'm a member of all the parties at this point. I feel that it was politics is not a spectator sport. Obviously, I work in a nonprofit where I have to engage with parties on the opposition and in government. And for me, I would identify myself as fiscally conservative, socially progressive. And my view at this point is to try to influence all of the parties to be more representative of the kind of government and the kind of opposition I'd want to see. So, yeah, I voted in the leadership, and I'll be voting in the UCP review as well.
There we go. So you're working for a nonprofit. We're going to talk about that nonprofit for a sec. Are you going to be working in the Nenshi administration?
No,
Well, there's been a lot of speculation. I mean, you guys did the tag teaming on the CBC interviews, and you had like a branded little sort of Batman and Robin thing. I'm not saying what one's Batman. I'm not saying what one's Robin. But you had a thing that was going on. So there were a lot of people that were speculating whether or not Jeromy Farkas was going to be jumping into the Team Nenshi portfolio.
no,
Uh,
I would say that I after the election, I think that it was probably one of the losing was probably one of the best things that could have happened to me. And I think for so long I got just dragged into the idea of, for me to be a good person, it meant being a good conservative. And by that, I meant big C conservative, right? And what I found after losing the election is that the people who were there for me and with me weren't necessarily the people who agreed with me in terms of my politics. And for me, my social network, my friendship circle was so focused on just people who I agreed with in terms of their politics and nothing else. And for me, I found just on a personal and even a professional level, like it has been so much just better solving for the people I enjoy being around and not justifying or waving away behavior that I disagree with or is immoral or unethical just by virtue of the fact that, well, I agree with their politics. So for me, I'm at a point in my life where, I just want to be around people I enjoy being around. As cliche or as dumb that sounds, and even just in terms of some of the things I'm trying to achieve professionally, right? I want to work with people to get stuff done, and when it comes to say even the work I'm doing now or other nonprofit boards that I sit on, I want to be able to be able to make the case based on data and evidence, not emotion and rhetoric. I want to be able to work with anybody to be able to advance some of the work I'm doing at the ranch or even with Big Brothers and Big Sisters, the Alex Community Health Center and others. So I find that I'm just so much more effective if I can not just try to be a good person first rather than a good conservative first, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that makes lots of sense. And that brings me to the things that you're setting up my segs perfectly today, sir. This is doing my job for me here. This is fantastic. Um, I keep hearing, and I'm trying to understand it. I keep hearing about this ranch thing. We talked about it a little bit before
Yeah.
when you were on last time, and now I'm hearing about this dam. And what's going on?
Yeah. So for folks who haven't ever been here, I'm CEO of the Glenbow Ranch Park Foundation. So we're a registered charity. We're nonpartisan. We're a nonprofit. I'm essentially an environmentalist now, or a conservationist at least. We help steward between Calgary and Cochrane in the northwest of Calgary. There's about 3,300 acres of protected green space that was contributed by the Harvey family less than 15 years ago to become a provincial park. I still find it astounding when you think of that green belt between the town and the city, stretching along the Bow River. One singular family used to own that, but instead of wanting to develop it, build houses, they decided that they wanted to be able to leave it for everybody to enjoy. So they contributed that to the provincial government. There was the promise that the lands would be protected, that my foundation would be established to essentially help build trails and co-manage the park. Since 2011, our foundation has contributed upwards of 20 or $30 million towards acquiring new land for the park, protecting other lands from development, building new trails, interpretive signage, that sort of thing. And unfortunately, the provincial government's looking at potentially, depending on how you ask, either being flexible or breaking that promise that the lands be protected, and instead a new major reservoir be constructed. And if this proposed Glenbow Dam were to proceed, it would flood all of the new Haskayne Park in the northwest Calgary, as well as upwards of a third to about half of Glenbow Ranch, sending the floodwater all the way back into the town of Cochrane. So while it would protect Calgary from the event of another flood, it would cause tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars of damage to the town itself. So of course, we want to protect the park. We want to keep the promise that was made that these lands will be protected forever for all of us. We think that it's extremely bad precedent to begin canceling the contracts that allow for the protection of these parks, or say the deregistration of provincial parks, period. And we're advocating for solutions that will help protect both the Calgary and Cochrane rather than just Calgary alone.
What are the solutions that you're advocating for?
Yeah, so there's three options on the table on the Bow River. One of them has recently actually been taken off the table, and that's upstream at Morley. The two live issues are either to go through the Glenbow Ranch or to build a new expanded reservoir up at Ghost Lake. So at the existing Ghost Reservoir, there's a dam that's about a century old, almost 100 years old. And the solution that we're proposing is to build a new dam that would be downstream of there. Once that dam is complete, then they would deconstruct and demolish the existing dam to essentially expand the bathtub. So both of the options would be sufficient to be able to help protect Calgary in the event of a 2013 level flood. But the ghost option would actually have the benefit of protecting both the town and the city rather than, say, protecting the city at the expense of the town.
I mean, the conversations around flood dams are, oh, they're spicy. They tend to get people pretty fired up pretty quick. What's the response been to the ghost dam proposal? And what are the objections that you've heard so far to that one? I mean, obviously, you've got some pretty strong objections with the park that you're trying to protect. What
Mm-hmm.
are the objections to the ghost one?
Yeah, so there's a couple pieces to that. The first is that there's a bit of a misunderstanding in terms of what dams can do, what problems they can solve, and how they solve these problems. So the first piece is that dams don't create water. They can only stop water that arrives at the structure and then it sits there and then eventually it can evaporate or be passed through downstream. So a lot of what we're trying to advocate for is more natural solutions. When you look at other jurisdictions that are actually advancing more comprehensive watershed management, the temptation for us is to assume that these are problems that we can solve with billions of dollars with concrete and steel, but that's a lot of human hubris. What we're finding is that when you actually invest in more, say, natural lands being rehabilitated and restored, say upstream on the eastern slopes, when you approach this with a regenerative process, that actually will create you more water when, say, concrete and steel will actually just sort of rearrange where the existing water is. So that's one big piece. The qualitative differences between Glenbow and Ghost are significant. Because Glenbow impacts about 15 to 16 kilometers of river channel, it's very wide and shallow, which means that this bathtub gets very warm and it has a lot more evaporation, which means that it's not as effective in the event of a drought. So when you compare that to Ghost, Ghost is relatively narrow and deep, which means that only about 2 kilometers of river channel is impacted, which means the bathtub is very deep, the water stays colder, and it's much more effective in the event of a drought. So the difference in our opinion is that, again, Ghost is more of a solution for drought and flood rather than just flooding alone. Glenbow it'll be the most effective in the event of protecting Calgary from flooding, but it doesn't actually do much to be able to help with drought because it just holds the water in a very, very warm and wide bathtub. So that said, we think that Ghost can be done cheaper, it can be done quicker. There's only 2 properties that would be impacted as a result of that infrastructure project, upwards of 30 at Glenbow, which means that the more moving parts, the more private landowners for expropriation, the longer things take. So we do believe that Ghost can be built quicker. It can solve the problem of the century-old dam that either TransAlta ratepayers or Alberta taxpayers will have to address at some point. And it also has the benefit of keeping the promise of these parks. We have heard from groups like the Nature Conservancy, other conservation organizations from coast to coast to coast. They're very, very carefully and closely watching what happens here in Alberta. Because if Alberta begins to deregister these parks and strip away protections and cancel contracts for the protection of these lands, then the incentive will be for governments from coast to coast to coast to no longer honor these agreements. Once the courts and case law has been settled, it's going to be a huge generational setback for the land conservation movement in Canada, period, if this sort of thing happens. What is the incentive, say, going forward for future families like the Harvey family or the Hastings family to set aside thousands of acres for all of us to be able to enjoy or to be protected going forward? There won't be any incentive if the government has such a easy out on things like that. So probably our 3 messages very succinctly, we need to protect both Calgary and Cochrane rather than just Calgary alone. We need to protect both flooding and drought rather than just say flooding alone. And we need to send a message in a place like Alberta that a handshake still means something.
What can people, you know, if people are listening to this or if they're watching this and they're going, "Holy heck, that sounds like something that seems like a no-brainer." What can people do to support uh, the the goals that you're setting forward of trying to protect the park and potentially move the reservoir to Ghost Lake?
Yeah, so one thing I'll emphasize is that for us, it's not so much about fighting a dam. We want instead to be supporting the government and getting a solution that serves everybody right. So to her credit, actually, Minister Schultz has been a strong leader on this file. I've toured her out personally through our working ranch operations. She's stood right beside me at the ground zero of the dam at the New Husking Visitor Center. She's been obviously I have to keep her cards close to her chest, but she's been very engaged through this process. Peter Guthrie as well, the local MLA as well as the infrastructure minister. He recently actually came out in opposition to this Glenbow Dam, so having his support for alternatives has been really big for us. But you know, for us, it's not so much about a fight. We want to make the case based on the data, the evidence. And I think that we're expecting a decision probably pretty soon here, perhaps as soon as September. If people are interested, they can definitely contact their MLA to tell them. Again, my advice would be this is not about stopping a dam. It's about advancing a solution that gets it right for everybody. Let's find a way to solve this problem because if a dam isn't built here, then potentially Calgary remains vulnerable to another flood like 2013 or worse, right? So we need to solve this problem. It's not, I'm not happy as a Calgarian if Calgary is kept vulnerable, but I'm also not happy as a Calgarian if, say, the town of Cochrane has to be damaged or destroyed in order to protect the city. There has to be some way that solves both problems at once. And we're really fortunate with the Ghost proposal that we have exactly that.
Anything else that you want people to hear on that file, if you will?
Yeah, and again, my pitch is more. It's like the last thing I would have expected to be when I thought about losing the last 2021 election is to sort of present myself as the Lorax. But I want to speak for a moment as the grass. So uh, when you think of all of the natural terrain features, the wetlands, everything that we have in a place like Husking Park or Glenbow Ranch Provincial Park, the rough fescue grass actually acts as a sponge. So when you think about the vegetation you see, it's about grass maybe 2 feet above ground, but it's about 10 feet underneath ground. So this vegetation is so important to helping soak up the water during the event of a flood, releasing it back during drought. So there's a lot of the stuff that, you know, the temptation is to think that it's concrete or steel to solve these problems, or it's a problem we can just throw billions of dollars at. But it's actually going to be quite more simpler than that. But it's going to require actually working with nature and working with the river rather than working at odds with it. That's what we're seeing with the best practice. All these other jurisdictions, these other places that have been able to get it right. So when it comes to protecting the parks, obviously, as an incredible jewel, I think that it's so important for us to protect and maintain this legacy of preservation. But on the flip side, having more green spaces, having more things like the natural terrain features, the wetlands we have, actually helps solve the problems. So, you know, there's folks out there who may think, well, we need to protect Calgary at all costs. Well, by paving over wetlands and by destroying natural terrain features like we have, it actually makes flooding worse when you actually take a look at the evidence and the data. But you know, it's a much more, to some people, kind of a touchy-feely kind of argument. But the evidence and the data is out there that to be able to protect us, to be able to serve, to address issues around climate, to be able to advance sustainability and watershed health more generally, we are going to need more places like Glenbow Ranch Provincial Park. And lastly, I would just say, if any of you haven't been out here, we're really, it's an incredible time to visit. It's the greenest that I've ever seen it. And if you ever buy the visitor center office, I'd love to give you or anyone else a tour.
Do you have any coal seams at the Glenbow Ranch Provincial Park?
Have any what?
Coal seams.
Cool. God, I hope not.
Do you have pristine views?
We have pristine views. Yes, we do.
You should be fine then.
Okay. We actually have we have the old Glenbow sandstone quarries. It was very interesting seeing the old, where the bricks were made that actually helped build the legislature in Edmonton as well as Calgary City Hall. Uh, yeah, it was very interesting to see a lot of the history, and it's more than just grasslands. There's a lot of meaning and stories and history there from our Treaty Seven neighbors. It's really it's yeah it's incredible to think that this thing is just on our doorstep, and it's just 5 minutes out of Calgary. So I would encourage anybody to come and visit us.
That's awesome. All right. Anything else you want to add to the conversation? Anything? Are you going to? Here's a question that I want to ask you,
Yeah.
and I apologize for the firestorm that I'm probably about to touch
Oh, no
off,
worries.
but I've lived in Calgary for 3 decades, give or take. I don't want to talk about exact numbers because I already spent enough time feeling old, but I've lived in Calgary for a little while now. I'm finding that my feelings around Stampede are getting more and more complicated.
Are you
Am
trying to
I?
cancel me? Is this what this
No,
is?
I'm not. This is why I was like, hey, if you don't want to touch this, that's cool. But like, you know, I it,
I'm smiling, by the way, for the people who can't see the video.
it does seem like the the machine that is the Calgary Stampede is getting more and more complicated. And I don't know if that's just a byproduct of I'm getting old, or I'm becoming more aware of things. But I'm curious, like, what are your current thoughts on the Calgary Stampede? Because I do, and I want to be clear, that I'm not setting you up to be canceled or nothing like that. Because I do believe that there are elements of the Calgary Stampede that do hold strong cultural, uh, almost 10 feet long roots in the province of Alberta. That was a grass joke. Um, there like I was pleased. I thought it was cool when I found out that the Stampede originated in southern Alberta in a little town called Raymond. I thought that was super cool. I think that there's a lot of heritage pieces that the Alberta Stampede does provide people. I think there's a lot of education that the Calgary Stampede does provide people. But then there's other things. So I'm just curious, like, as somebody who's been involved with the Stampede in multiple different ways, am I alone, or do you think that there's some conversations that are going to happen that are going to have to happen about the Calgary Stampede, or is it just like, is it like the banks in the financial crisis? They're just too big to fail? Like,
No,
take
I
a
sort of
minute to that.
see, I see Stampede more like Christmas, where, there's shitty parts of it sometimes, but and there's going to be over commercialization in some parts. But at the end of the day, I think we're so much better for having it. And, there's highs and there's lows and, there's blemishes for sure. But I would say that especially in the changing of the guard and the Stampede leadership, you have a real full throated embrace of sure telling the story of how the West was won, but also incorporating the First Nations. Like that is such an incredible piece, or at least an incredible pillar to why the Stampede exists in the first place, which I would encourage a lot of folks to kind of go through the history of that. Is incredibly telling to learn some of the history of that. I think it also tells you a lot too. Like you see the full on embrace of say Pride, for example. Like I would say that it's not to your grandfather's Stampede. That said, there's always going to be there's always going to be pain points and friction, but I think we're so much better for having the Calgary Stampede. Period. Other cities would kill for that brand opportunity, but I would say that Stampede would be a missed opportunity if it stuck to the story that we're only telling ourselves for the last say 100 years. I think that to the extent that Stampede will still continue to be relevant to folks, that'll still be the kind of magic that Christmas brings. It's going to have to hinge on telling the stories of how Alberta is today, right? So it can't just be sort of a museum to white cowboy culture, right? I think that the new, especially the changing of the guard of the Stampede leadership, you're seeing a much more ambitious international agenda. You're seeing folks who are wanting to better tell the stories of newcomers coming to Stampede. You're seeing it just incredible institutions like I would say the Ismaili uh, uh, Stampede breakfast is probably one of the biggest places to be during Stampede, and that really shows you, I think, the fact that Stampede isn't necessarily what we've been telling ourselves it is, but it's rather a place that is actually pretty welcoming of newcomers. And I think that as long as we kind of keep that focus of it, the fact that this is about Western hospitality, it's not insular, it's about welcoming other people, it's about embracing those stories in a much more grander tapestry. I think that that will always be Stampede at its best. But there's always going to be elements there that the over corporatization. Yeah, like I'm not going to go on here and just complain about Stampede. You've probably heard about.
No, that's not what I'm trying to get you to do at all.
Yeah, I think it's exhausting, right? For me as I'll just be real with you, man. Like as the counselor who represented the Stampede grounds, I had to be at Stampede every single day during the 10 days. So I've actually been on the grounds at least like 50 days, which can be exhausting. But I would say that even then, like I got to learn so much. I got to meet so many incredible people. And I think that we would be so much worse off if we didn't have something like the Stampede. And frankly, other cities, other countries would kill for that kind of brand. But I think the danger would be to rest on our laurels. I think that Stampede is going to have to continue to be inclusive. It's going to have to continue to make the case for why it is the best outdoor show on earth. And I think that it's always a challenge every year to remain relevant without necessarily having to reinvent the entire recipe. But there's a lot of things on the margins, like when you look at say the sexual abuse allegations and lawsuits on Stampede adjacent organizations. This is not a case to be made for giving them a free pass. I think that our friends should welcome the scrutiny. They should welcome the challenge to be better, to do better, to demonstrate leadership and excellence in all of those areas, right? So, as a born and raised Calgarian, as a guy who literally works on a ranch with 300 or 400 head of cattle, like I'm not going to say anything negative about the Stampede, but I will definitely support the idea that we have to keep our friends honest, that we have to challenge our friends to do better, to be better. And that's really what being Calgarian is about. It's the fact that so many people, in my mind, can move here and see themselves reflected in the stories that we're telling about this place, that we're telling about ourselves. And growing up in Dover in East Calgary, I'll be blunt with you, I felt like we sort of lived in a different world east of the Deerfoot. And a lot of the stories that at least I heard about what it meant to be Calgarian or what it meant to be Albertan weren't necessarily reflected in, say, who I saw in my friends group or even just in my own personal upbringing growing up, right? So these are all healthy tensions and healthy challenges that you'll have in a place like Calgary that still just seems to be churning from brand to brand to brand. And who knows, maybe it'll settle down sometime soon, but it's going to take leadership either way.
See, the way I was thinking about it, I'll share this, and then you can tell me how wrong I am or not. The way I was thinking about it yesterday, because like I said, we're recording this on July 2nd.
Mm.
Yesterday was Canada Day. And Canada Day, I am a proud Canadian. I want to be really, really clear about that. I love Canada. I got a tattoo of a maple leaf right here, which is the heart side. Um, but Canada is complicated. And I don't think that acknowledging that is a bad thing. I mean, I love the ideals of what Canada can be. I hold them very dear to my heart, but there's some other things that we absolutely have to work on as well. And I think that that's kind of like I was ruminating on this yesterday because I was like, freaking things are not the way that I want them. And the thought occurred to me, well, like I guess this in many ways the Stampede is like Canada. There's some big, big problems that need to be addressed, and there's some historical wrongs that need to be addressed. But that doesn't mean that you throw the baby out with the bathwater. And that's where I landed. So there's my story about that.
Yeah, and I would say that it's sort of considered kind of an untouchable topic. Like I don't know if you can ever. I've probably just rendered myself unelectable.
Oh
This
man, my
period in the
DMs are going to be on fire after this episode.
Yeah, but it was some of those questions I asked. Like, say for example, I believe I was the only city councilor to vote against that BMO Center expansion, right? Hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, and I wanted to see sort of the business case that I felt really wasn't there, right? But even then, when I had voted against the expansion, like I got so many messages saying that I was against the Stampede, against the Big Pride, or even when I voted against the arena, because I felt that the public benefit wasn't there, like somehow as an anti-Calgarian, right? Like that's come on, like nobody's taking away my Calgarian card. I was born here, right? But that doesn't mean that you have to be born here to be Calgarian or to lay claim to living in this place, right? And like I would say that these are the types of questions and debates that any city has or should have. There shouldn't be untouchable topics because at the end of the day, I think the incentive or at least the intent should be good faith discussions, right? This is not about trying to drag down what it means to be Calgarian or what the Stampede is. It's about a challenge to do better, to be better, and anybody who doesn't want to have that type of conversation, I really have to question what their motivations might be because as uncomfortable as it can be, even in my own personal, professional, political career, like I felt like I can just get so much further when I stop being defensive all the time, when I can actually try to listen, learn, take the constructive feedback. Because at the end of the day, I want to see the Stampede still exist 100 years from now. I want that to be a sustainable model. I want to see that as a storytelling opportunity for not just the first 100 years of Calgary's development, but for every single year since its founding. I want to see all of these things that make Calgary great reflected in Stampede, if the Stampede is going to continue to be Calgary showcasing itself to the world.
See, and this is why I love having conversations with you, sir, because there's a acknowledgement of the nuance that's involved in here. Like it should not be verboten to say, hey, I think we might have a problem here. Can we talk about it? That should not be a disqualifier for engaging in public discourse unless you're hosting an anti-vax conference under the UCP label in Calgary Lighthearted, in which case then it should be disqualifying. But I'm not going to ask you to respond to that one. But there is a huge value, I think, in being able to have conversations that have some depth and some nuance and to say, hey, you know what? We can say there's value in this thing and we should not get rid of this thing. But we also have some issues that we really, really need to address in order to make sure that this thing has longevity and it is able to do the things that we all want it to do, like Canada. There's my bit there. Mr. Farkas, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to chat today. Anything else that you want to say to people? Anything else you want people to hear before we wrap it up and I let you off the hook?
No, I would just say I'm serious about the tour. Come and visit me out at the ranch sometime. I'd be
Yeah, I
thrilled
definitely
to
will. I
show you
definitely
around.
will. I have some time coming up that I will hopefully be able to do some of that stuff. So I definitely will. What are the hours?
For you, I can be here anytime in daylight.
Perfect. Um, you running? Have you made a decision? Is there because I keep hearing these rumors
What are they saying?
that you're going to run for stuff.
Life got a lot better for me when I stopped worrying what other people thought of me.
Perfect. Jeromy Farkas, thank you so much for taking the time. I want to throw your socials out there. Where do people follow you at if they want to hear about this dam issue? If they want to hear about, I wrote it down, 10 feet long roots. That just blows my mind. Where do people find you?
Yeah, so for the Glenbow Ranch Park Foundation, you can find us at www.grpf.ca. My details are ceo@grpf.ca. That's my email, and on Twitter at JEROMYYYC.
Awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time, sir.
Yeah, thanks, man.
And that's it for another episode of The Breakdown. As always, if you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here, we would love nothing more than if you thought about signing up to be one of our Patreon sponsors at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab, where for just the price of a fancy cup of coffee a month, you can help us continue to produce this kind of content. Whether you're listening to the audio version of the podcast, in which case maybe leave a review and a rating, or whether you're watching it on one of our streaming platforms. We want to say a big thank you to everybody who is part of the Breakdowns audience. And as always, take care of each other and keep the conversation going.